This first couple paragraphs when we start. Thank you. Well, good morning. Starting a new quarter here. The message of Hebrews. I'm Pastor Steve Caza. And those online, welcome. So glad you're here joining us to study Hebrews. It should be a very good quarter. And I kind of perused through it just to get a feel, as you just skim through the different weeks and the titles. And it seems like it's going to be a nice one. Well, let's begin with a word of prayer. Father in heaven, we just ask, dear Lord, for your Holy Spirit to be with us as we're studying a book that really a deep significance for Jesus' ministry for us and why when Jesus came, everything he gave us was better, and how we can participate and benefit from his ministry. In Jesus' name, amen. Our memory text, Hebrews chapter 10, verse 36. For you have need of endurance, so that after you have done the will of God, you may receive the promise. Marcia, would you read for us, please?
A Jewish document written a few decades after Hebrews, around AD 100, contains a prayer. All this I have spoken before you, O Lord, because you have said that it was for us that you created this world. And now, O Lord, behold these nations which are reputed as nothing, domineer over us and devour us. But we, your people, whom you have called your firstborn, only begotten, zealous for you and most dear, have been given into their hands. The readers of Hebrew probably felt something similar. If they were God's children, why were they going through such suffering? Thus Paul wrote Hebrews to strengthen the faith of the believers amid their trials. He reminded them and us that the promises of God will be fulfilled through Jesus, who is seated at the right hand of the Father and who will soon take us home. In the meantime, Jesus mediates the Father's blessings to us, so we need to hold fast to our faith until the end.
No, I read the wrong memory text. Someone raise your hand when I do something like that. I just opened up to the wrong one. Sorry about that. Let me read it over. Thank you for reading that, Marcia. I just opened to the wrong page. This is the main point of the things we are saying. We have such a high priest who is seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty of the heavens. In Sunday's lesson, Jesus our King. This is very interesting when we look at that. Who would like to read Hebrews chapter 1, verses 5 through 14? Anyone like to read? Leslie, would you like to read? Do you have a mic?
Here we go.
Okay, here it comes.
Hebrews 1, 5 through 14. For to which of the angels did he ever say, "You are my son, today I have begotten you"? And again, "I will be a father to him, and he shall be a son to me." And when he again brings the firstborn into the world, he says, "And let all the angels of God worship him." And of the angels he says, "Who makes his angels winds and his ministers a flame of fire." But of the Son he says, "Your throne, O God, is forever and ever, and the righteous scepter is the scepter of his kingdom. You have loved righteousness and hated lawlessness. Therefore God, your God, has anointed you with the oil of gladness above your companions. And you, Lord, in the beginning laid the foundations of the earth, and the heavens are the works of your hands. They will perish, but you remain, and they all will become old like a garment, and like a mantle you will roll them up. Like a garment they will also be changed, but you are the same, and your years will not come to an end. But to which of the angels has he ever said, "Sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet"? Are they not all ministering spirits sent out to render service for the sake of those who will inherit salvation?
So the main point of Hebrews is that Jesus is the ruler, and he's seated at the right hand of the Father. But what happened when, in the beginning, Adam was the ruler? under God and Jesus. But when Adam sinned, what did that give Satan an opportunity to do? Okay, claim the earth as his kingdom. That's right. So one of the roles of Jesus when he came was to do what? Okay, take it back. That's right. It was always his anyways. He never gave up dominion. Adam never was the king. He was ruling as a kind of like underneath Jesus. And so Jesus came back and he took that. So there's 3 sections here. The first section in what Leslie read, and this is in that first paragraph, God installs Jesus as the royal son. Hebrews chapter 1, verse 5. So he's the royal son. The second one is God introduces the son to the heavenly court who worship him. Why was that important when Jesus became a man, that Jesus told the angels, you can worship him? Why was that important? Otherwise, they would be breaking the commandment. Okay, otherwise they'd be breaking the commandment. About how? Okay, that's basically what he was telling them. My son hasn't lost any position at all, not he's a human. I brought him in the world, but you still worship him. And we see when the wise men came, what did they do when they had brought their gifts to Bethlehem? Worshipped him. When Jesus healed people, they worshipped him. And he said, you shall worship the Lord your God, and him only shall you serve. When Satan said, fall down and worship me, Jesus said, no, no, no. So when Jesus accepted worship, he understood his rank. He knew who he was, that he was the real ruler. And the disciples worshiped him. And today, we worship him too. Yes. So he's worthy of worship. And then third, God enthrones the Son, the actual conferral of power over the earth. And that's verses 13 and 14. It says here, but to which of the angels has he ever said, sit at my right hand till I make your enemies your footstool? Are they not all ministering spirits sent forth to minister to those who will inherit salvation? Well, he never told any of the angels to have any of that type of authority, to sit at my right hand. There's only one being worthy to worship. I should say, to sit at the right hand, and that's Jesus. He's the only one. I'm just going to finish this day, Michael, and then we'll switch. So there were promises that were given to David. How did Jesus fulfill those promises? He was from the lineage of David, and what did God promise David? Leslie?
If his seed was faithful, they would always have someone on the throne.
Okay, they would always have someone on the throne. And how did most of the kings work out? No.
They failed.
Yeah, they failed, and God actually disciplined them for failing. He promised that he would discipline them. He told David, if they don't, I will discipline them. But Jesus came off as more than a conqueror and a victor to claim the throne. So if Satan or any evil angel points their finger at him, you're not worthy to sit on the throne, what did Jesus say? I met the conditions. I have a legal claim on that throne because I met every condition handed down to David for what the king should do. It's my throne. I got it because I was faithful. Not only am I the Son of God, number one, but number two, I actually carried out the requirements. So I have it. It's mine, and it's no one else's. So we come to Revelation chapter 5, verse 5, and it says that Jesus is a lion of the tribe of Judah. And that's the second paragraph, the last verse. And then in the next paragraph says, Hebrews, of course, the last paragraph, Hebrews, of course, concurs. God has fulfilled his promises to David in Jesus. God gave him a great name, Hebrews 1:4, installed him as his own son, Hebrews 1:5, affirmed him forever as creator and Lord, Hebrews 1:8 through 12. Can you just imagine a Hebrew convert coming out of Judaism reading Hebrews chapter 1? Their eyes must have been like, boing, wow, the Messiah has come. Jesus is the Messiah. The next one says, and seated him at his right hand. What's it mean to be seated at the right hand? It's a position
Great power.
of power, authority. That's right, power and authority. So when you're seated at someone's right hand, that means you have certain privileges that are installed on you for where you sit. And they need to be respected when you're sitting there. I think the last one here. Furthermore, according to Hebrews 4, Jesus leads the people into the rest of God. And we are reminded that Jesus is the builder of the house of God. So Sunday, God teaches in this page that Jesus is the king. Remember before Pilate, what was the claim the priests were saying about Jesus? He's the what?
He said he was the King of the Jews.
King of the Jews. And Pilate asked him, are you the king of the Jews? Jesus gave him a very interesting answer. You remember what it was? Yeah, it is as you say, or something like that. Yeah. So Jesus is the king, and someday he's actually going to set up a what? His kingdom. That's right. The kingdom come, thy will be done. He's a king, and he's going to someday inherit and actually set up. And through faith in him, we can be part of that kingdom. And that's why we're here today. It's because we want to be part of that kingdom. We are meeting the conditions to enter the kingdom like Jesus met the conditions to be the king of the kingdom. So when we walk through the pearly gates, it says, blessed are those who keep his commandments, for they have a right to the tree of life and may enter into the gates of the city. So we will actually have a right because we met the conditions by faith and through God's power. Okay, Michael's going to take over at this point, Michael Jenkins.
Happy Sabbath, everybody.
Happy Sabbath.
I did not even know that we had a large print version. This is really cool. It's got lots of room for notes and everything. Let me really quick get back to where I was here. And we're going to pick right up where the pastor left off. So we've already addressed Jesus as our king. In Monday, we start to talk about Jesus as our mediator. And immediately, we can ask this question. How important is a mediator in what we believe as Christians?
Very important.
Essential. It's so important that without that, we are the most miserable people on the planet. We literally have the linchpin of everything we believe is taken out, and everything falls apart without a mediator. And so when we talk about Jesus as mediator, we're talking about an essential function, a really the most important function that we have in our religion. And before I get too far down here, one of the things I love about Hebrews is that it is a letter from Paul to the Hebrews. And so Paul is pulling from his knowledge of what it is that the Hebrews believed, his knowledge as a Pharisee before he was converted to Christianity. And so he has this insight into Jewish belief and tradition and the way they think and the way that they do things that many of the disciples wouldn't have, but were aware of, but didn't have the skill to really be able to dig deep in there. And so as we talk through this, it's interesting to me that we have the ability to see all of these ways that Paul is using this information where it may not have been readily apparent to the disciples at the time. All right, so we've got to compare a few verses here at the beginning of Monday. An interesting concept in the Old Testament theology is that the promised Davidic king would represent the nation before God. So we want to compare a few verses. I'm going to go ahead and pull out my digital Bible here. If we could get somebody to read Exodus 4, 22 and 23. Do we have a volunteer for that? Thank you very much.
Thou shalt say to Pharaoh, Thus saith the Lord, Israel is my son, even my firstborn. And I say unto thee, Let my son go, that he may serve me. If thou refuse to let him go, behold, I will slay thy son, even thy firstborn.
All right, and then 2 Samuel 7, 12 through 14. Do we have a volunteer for that? I'll go ahead and jump in there. I have it readily available here. We can get somebody to read Deuteronomy 12, 8 through 10 after I finish. 2 Samuel chapter 7, verses 12 through 14. And when thy days be fulfilled, and thou shalt sleep with thy fathers, I will set up thy seed after thee, which shall proceed out of thy bowels, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build an house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he shall be my son. If he commit iniquity, I will chasten him with the rod of men and with the stripes of the children of men. Deuteronomy 12. Go ahead.
You shall not do after all the things.
Bring the mic up. Bring the mic up a little bit. Sorry about that.
You shall not do after all the things that we do here this day. Every man whatsoever is right in his own eyes. For ye are not as yet come to the rest and to the inheritance which the Lord your God giveth you. But when you go over Jordan and dwell in the land which the Lord your God giveth you to inherit, and when he giveth you rest from all your enemies round about, so that ye dwell in safety.
And then, of course, Psalm chapter 132, verses 1 through 5 and 11 through 14. Do we have a volunteer for that as well? Leslie, thank you.
Psalm 132, 1 through 5. Lord, remember David and all his afflictions, how he sware unto the Lord and vowed unto the mighty God of Jacob. Surely I will not come into the tabernacle of my house, nor go up into my bed. I will not give sleep to mine eyes, nor slumber to my eyelids, until I find out a place for the Lord, and habitation for the mighty God of Jacob.
And then verses 11 through 14.
Sure. The Lord hath sworn in truth unto David, he will not turn from it. Excuse me. Of the fruit of thy body will I set upon thy throne. If thy children will keep my covenant and my testimony that I shall teach them, their children shall sit upon thy throne forevermore. For the Lord has chosen Zion, he has desired it for his habitation. This is my rest forever. Here will I dwell, for I have desired it.
All right, so the question that we have here that is asking us to compare all these verses is asking us specifically what promises to Israel would be fulfilled through the promised Davidic king. So what promises did we hear in there? There were quite a few of them.
Israel was God's son.
That Israel was God's son. Mm-hmm. What else did we hear in there?
Be safe from their enemies.
They would be safe from their enemies. That's another very, very important promise.
We give them a place of rest.
Exactly. Anything else? Ultimately, what all these verses are doing is they're all foreshadowing Jesus, the promise of Jesus as mediator. And so all of these things sort of grow out of that. Through Jesus' ministry, we would be adopted as sons, given the same birthright that Christ gets as the firstborn of the Son of God. Would give the Israelites a place where they would rest from their enemies. Ultimately, that's what we're looking for as well. The great enemy, Satan, we can only be safe from him in the presence of the Lord. We can only be safe, truly safe from him, once he's dethroned and his kingdom is destroyed. God would also choose a place among them where his name would dwell, among us. Where in the Old Testament, we saw that God chose that place to be the temple, whether it was that temple that went with Moses in the wilderness and then into the promised land, or the temple that Solomon built and continued through that time. But we see in the New Testament, when Jesus dies, that curtain is ripped from the top down. One of the things that's not always mentioned about this is that what that did is that opened up to public view the holiest of holies in Solomon's temple to demonstrate that the Shekinah glory was no longer there. Not that God's presence was gone, but that it was gone from the temple because the Son of God had come. That's an important distinction to make. So all these promises are fulfilled and typified in Jesus' life and work. And one thing I think about very, very frequently, and that comes up very frequently in the New Testament, in the letters of Paul, is the heavenly sanctuary. And this was one of the unique doctrines that really attracted me to the Seventh-day Adventist Church when I was studying to become a member. And I would challenge people who do not believe in the heavenly sanctuary doctrine. And I would challenge them by asking them one question. When did Jesus ever act as high priest on earth? And it's a question that has no answer, because Christ never acted as a high priest on earth. Primarily because he could never enter into the temple with his own blood, that perfect blood sacrifice that needed to go to the very center of the temple. Once he died, he had that blood in his possession. Now, finishing up on this point, I want to read the very last paragraph here. The good news is that God sent his Son to be born as the Son of David, and he has been perfectly faithful. Therefore, God is able to fulfill in him all the promises he made to his people. When God blesses the king, all his people share in the benefits. This is why Jesus is the mediator of God's blessing to us. He is the mediator in that he is the channel through whom God's blessings flow. Our ultimate hope of salvation is found only in Jesus and what he has done for us. This is critically important for us to do everything we can to understand. Everything in the Bible hinges on this. Everything in the Bible revolves around this. Our entire religion, our hope, revolves around Christ as mediator. His other roles are also just as important. But as mediator, it is really targeting the main struggle that we're fighting with right now, that struggle that we have with sin. Again, this points us back to the temple. And one of my favorite doctrines about the Adventist Church is, or rather not doctrines, but focus. We have a focus on the temple on earth. We teach a lot about it. There's so much about it that is important to us now and that teaches us about what's going on in heaven currently. And we see how that is important in the things that Paul teaches in his letters in the New Testament. Let's go ahead and move on to Tuesday. We'll see if we can get through to Friday, because I have something really interesting I want to share with y'all on Friday. Jesus is our champion. And so we'll move on to the next day. We'll look at 1 Samuel 8, 19, and 20, and Hebrews 2, 14 through 16. And I want to ask, before we actually look at these verses, this is maybe not a fair question for us, because just about all of us, unless we've come from another country, we've lived under the same government style our entire lives. What would you look for in a king? Just a few one-word answers. What would you look for in a king? Integrity.
Yeah, honesty.
Honesty. What other qualities would we want out of a king?
Devotion.
Devotion. I think justice comes to mind, honestly. Wisdom. Very, very important. Anything else? If you were to pick one person who is alive today, what qualities would you be looking for in that individual to be able to run, let's say, a country like the United States? Naturally, it wouldn't happen because we're a democracy, but honesty, integrity, devotion. What else would we look for? Kindness. I think patriotism is another thing we might overlook. And I think that when we're looking at these qualities, we see a lot of those qualities in Jesus, and especially, I think, overlooked is patriotism. Jesus has a great amount of patriotism for heaven, so much so that he was willing to die for the kingdom of heaven. But let's go ahead and go into these verses, and we'll talk a little bit about what the Israelites were looking for in terms of a king. 1 Samuel 8, 19, and 20. Do we have somebody? If you would, please. Thank you.
But the people refused to listen to Samuel. No, they said, we want a king over us. Then we will be like all the other nations, with a king to lead us and go out before us and fight our battles.
Whenever something starts with the people refuse to listen to the prophet, you know that nothing good is going to come after that. Let's move on to Hebrews 2, 14 through 16. Do we have someone who can read that for us?
I can get it.
Thank you, Leslie.
Therefore, since the children share in flesh and blood, he himself likewise also partook of the same, that through death he might render powerless him who had the power of death, that is, the devil, and might free those who through fear of death were subject to slavery all their lives. For assuredly he does not give help to angels, but he gives help to the descendants of Abraham.
Okay, so what can we glean from these two verses that helps us understand what the Israelites were looking for in a king and how they were fulfilled in Jesus? So let's first talk about what the Israelites were looking for in a king. What was their primary qualification for wanting a king? To be like the people around them. Now, what do we say about that as Christians? What's our attitude towards being like the people around us? No, that's a bad thing, because the people around us, it's often not thought about too much. Why don't we want to be like just the average person around us? The average person is prone to wax and wane in their loyalty, in their devotion to all sorts of different things. I think it's also relevant for us to say the average person has not accepted the responsibilities that come along with being a Christian, where we look at the law and we look at the requirements and we say, hey, I'm not going to do these things. I'm going to do these things. Just, I think the other day when I was working, I work at Amazon, and one of the shifts that I have is mandatory overtime. And there's an overlap between my weekday shift and the weekend shift. And the people on the weekend shift were saying, hey, you're doing a good job over here. You should come over to our shift. And I had to remind them 3 times. I said, hey, I'm a Seventh-day Adventist. I don't work on Saturdays. Y'all can't afford me. And so we subscribe to these beliefs that separate us from the average person. And so we subscribe to things that they don't necessarily subscribe to. But especially at that time, during the Israelites' time, the context of that is we want a king to be like all the nations around us because we don't want to be different. Being different is bad. Being different makes us a target. What was the issue? What was the problem with them not listening to the prophet? They wanted a king.
They had a king.
They had a king. That's exactly the issue. I can imagine Samuel just standing there slack-jawed looking at him like, do you not understand what we've been talking about since Moses' time? And that is the chronic condition of Israel. But it's important for us to recognize that is also the chronic condition of the church from just about every era, including now. And I don't want to spend too much time on this because I do want to get to Friday because that's the issue on Friday. So the Israelites wanted a king to be their judge and their leader in battle because they forgot that God was their king. The complete restoration of God's rule over his people came with Jesus. As our king, Jesus leads us in the battle against the enemy. I think, again, our view of what a king is and does is narrowed by a lot of the narratives that we see, a lot of the stories that we read nowadays. It was the king's job to defend the kingdom. All of his subjects, all of his servants, all of the serfs that were conscripted into the army, they were all serving the king. The king's job was to defend the kingdom. But the Israelites said, we want someone else to defend the kingdom. And that is a bad thing to say when the king is listening. It's a bad thing to say when the king is as good as God is. But God had this knowledge beforehand that his people would be this way. He still intended to send Jesus. Now, I like this next paragraph that talks about the battle between David and Goliath. I had never really thought of that as the same sort of battle between Jesus and the devil. And it is, in a very real way, a kind of inverted shadow of the cross, where you have David triumphing over Goliath by killing Goliath and cutting off his head. In a way, when Christ refused to give in to Satan's temptations and he went to the cross, that was him cutting off the head of the devil, no longer allowing the devil to have dominion or to have that kind of power as ruler of the earth. It was also establishing Jesus' supremacy over sin and the ability that he had to defeat sin. I want to jump ahead a little bit here. And I want to go to the next to last paragraph on Tuesday and read Hebrews 2:14 to you, 14 through 16. Forasmuch then as the children are partakers of the flesh and blood, he also himself likewise took part in the same, that through death he might destroy him that had the power of death, that is, the devil, and deliver them who through fear of death were all their lifetime subject to bondage. For verily he took not on him the nature of angels, but he took on him the seed of Abraham. Have you ever felt like you are one of those who through the fear of death are subject to bondage? It's not uncommon, even among the church members. It is in the same way the Israelites were able to have the prophets living with them, and they were still able to fail in some of the most mundane, some of the most common things that we nowadays recognize as behaviors that you should obey. They still had that fear of death and were in that way subject to bondage. And I think a lot of us experience that as well. I'll come back to that later. But I love what it says here in our study guide. It says, Hebrews 2:14 through 16 alludes to the notion that God would save Israel in solo combat. That's a very personal thing. One-on-one combat, hand-to-hand. It's a thing that we don't really expect of generals and of kings. But in terms of David and Goliath, that one battle, that one fight determined the entire course of that offensive. In the same way, that one moment on the cross, I think really one of the critical moments is when the Pharisees said to Jesus, he saved others, let him save himself. That to me would be a huge temptation. Spitting in the eye of God directly, saying, oh, well, you were able to cure other people of leprosy. You were able to bring people back from the dead. Come down off that cross. Save yourself. I can't even imagine the kind of temptation that Jesus was facing at that moment. But in that moment, he chose. Yes.
One more time when there's a solo battle is at the end of the millennium.
Exactly. By that time, the battle has already been decided, but it is still, like you said, it is a solo battle. It is a one-on-one battle. We don't have to fight. It's all of hell's fury thrown at the walls, and Christ says, no, this is finished. All right, Wednesday. So we talked about mediator, we talked about king, and we talked about champion. Now we get into the thick of it, the high priest. Hebrews 5 through 7 introduces a second function of Jesus. He is our high priest. The author explains that this fulfills a promise God had made to the promised Davidic king, that he would be a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. Now, this is actually something somewhat unique. How many of the kings of Israel were also the high priests? Exactly. And so we have a uniqueness in Christ that not only can he be the leader of the nation, not only can he be the mediator, but he also can go into the temple, go into the presence of God directly. Let's go ahead and read Leviticus. Chapter 1, verses 1 through 9. I'll go ahead and take that one. Then we have Leviticus 10, 8 through 11. Malachi 2, 7. Numbers 6, 22 through 26. And also, again, naturally, Hebrews 5, verses 1 through 4. So I'll grab the first one here, Leviticus 1, 1 through 9. And while I'm doing that, we'll have a few of you look up those other verses. Do you have a volunteer for Leviticus 10, 8 through 11? All right, thank you. And Malachi 2, 7. Thank you very much. Numbers 6, 22 through 26. Thank you. Hebrews 5, 1 through 4. Yes. And before we read any of these verses, I want to make sure we get the question, because sometimes I have a tendency to read these verses and then forget what they said when I get to the question. So what functions did the priest fulfill? That's the question we want to answer through these verses. Now, Leviticus is all about priesthood, so we're going to get a lot of answers from there as well. Leviticus 1, 1 through 9. And the Lord called unto Moses and spake unto him out of the tabernacle of the congregation, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, and say unto them, If any man of you bring an offering unto the Lord, ye shall bring your offering of the cattle, even of the herd, and of the flock. If his offering be a burnt sacrifice of the herd, let him offer a male without blemish. He shall offer it to his own voluntary will at the door of the tabernacle of the congregation before the Lord. And he shall put his hand upon the head of the burnt offering, and it shall be accepted for him to make an atonement for him. And he shall kill the bullock before the Lord, and the priests, Aaron's sons, shall bring the blood and sprinkle the blood round about upon the altar that is by the door of the tabernacle of the congregation. And he shall flay the burnt offering and cut it into his pieces. And the sons of Aaron, the priests, shall put fire upon the altar and lay the wood in order upon the fire. And the priests, Aaron's sons, shall lay the parts, the head and the fat, in order upon the wood that is on the fire which is upon the altar. But his inwards and his legs shall he wash in water, and the priest shall burn all on the altar to be a burnt sacrifice, an offering made by fire of a sweet savor unto the Lord. All right, before we move any further, what did we see in there? What is the answer to this question, the function of the priest?
He mediates and for the sinner.
Exactly. He's accepting on behalf of the sinner, or rather, he's accepting the sacrifice from the sinner, and he is doing the preparation of that sacrifice to make it acceptable to the Lord, according to the Lord's prescription. Leviticus 10, 8 through 11.
The Lord spake unto Aaron, saying, Do not drink wine nor strong drink, thou nor thy sons with thee, when thou go into the tabernacle of the congregation, lest you die. And it shall be a statute forever throughout your generations, and that you may put differences between holy and unholy, and between clean and unclean, and that ye may teach the children of Israel all the statutes which the Lord has spoken unto them by the hand of Moses.
Perfect. All right, I want to sort of speed through this a little bit. We got the idea in there that the priest discerns between the clean and the unclean. Does this ring a bell at all? Anything we've heard in Scripture that Jesus does where he divides between the clean and the unclean? The sheep and the goats is a very, very good example. But for us individually as Christians, are we supposed to discern the difference between holy and unholy things? That means there are specific expectations. We are to discern between the holy and the unholy. Are we to partake of the holy? Yes. Are we to partake of the unholy? No. Clear expectations. We are to have that discernment, to be able to know the difference between good and evil, not relative to our perception or relative to our life experience. God says, this is right, this is wrong. You should know the difference between those things. And then God expects us to follow through. Malachi 2:7.
For the lips of a priest should keep knowledge, and people should seek the law from his mouth, for he is the messenger of the Lord of hosts.
All I'm going to say about this is that we see in the life of Jesus that he was the greatest example of this specifically in the Scriptures. And we also see parallel to that, the Pharisees are the greatest failure of this. At the same exact time, we have these two polarities represented, living side by side. The Pharisees misrepresenting, misinterpreting, and intentionally confusing these laws, where we have Jesus expanding on, explaining, and defining these laws in ways that help the common person understand. Numbers 6:22 through 26.
Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to Aaron and to his sons, saying, Thus ye shall bless the sons of Israel. Ye shall say to them, The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine on you, and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance on you and give you peace.
All right, so what do we find in there? Blessings, the dealing out of blessings. And then very quickly, Hebrews 5, verses 1 through 4.
Every high priest is selected from among men and is appointed to represent them in matters related to God, to offer gifts and sacrifice for sins. He is able to deal gently with those who are ignorant and are going astray, since he himself is subject to weakness. This is why he has to offer sacrifices for his own sins as well as for the sins of the people. No one takes this honor upon himself. He must be called by God, just as Aaron was.
Great. That last verse, Hebrews 5, 1 through 4. What do we find in there that is answering our question, the functions of the priest fulfilled?
Called. Have to be called.
Specifically called. Exactly. So let me ask you a question. In context, ancient Israel, who is called to be the priests? Who were called to be the priests of the temple? Aaron, his sons, later the Levites, the tribe of Levi. Okay? Now, who is called to be a priest? Last paragraph of Wednesday. However, in 1 Peter 2:9, we see something else. We, believers in Jesus, are called a royal priesthood. You ever wanted to go in and trace your lineage? We can trace it right back to Levi, all of us. This role implies incredible privileges. Priests could approach God in the sanctuary. Today, we can approach God through prayer and with confidence. How are we capable of doing that? Through Jesus. Why? He is not only the priest, he is also the mediator. Who is he also? We see all these roles wrapped up. He's the king. He's the champion. All these roles are wrapped up in his position that he's in right now that allows us to actually go before God. He's the champion over sin. His ability to overcome sin is greater than our propensity to sin. His role as mediator gives him the ability to bridge the gap between God and us. His role as king allows him to delegate to us the work that God has set out for him, to also delegate to us these roles of being the priests underneath the high priest. And finally, as high priest, he's able to accept our offerings and lift them up to God. Our prayers do not reach God the Father without Christ, period. We are too filthy, we are too dirty to be able to stand in his presence, to be able to share with God our thoughts and our feelings. Without Christ, there is no bridging that gap. Now, quickly, it is 10:18. I need to be done by 10:30. Is that correct? All right, I want to make sure I get into this. Last day, because I want to read something to you that bridges these gaps in here. So let's head over to Thursday. Real quickly, we'll go through that. Jesus mediates a better covenant. So who can tell me what the first covenant was? Or the old covenant, I might say. What was the old covenant?
Shadow of things to come.
Mm-hmm.
Obey and live.
Obey and live. And what did the people say? All these things we will do. Were they able to do it? No. So what does that mean? Or rather, what was necessary to be put in place afterwards? Yes? That's more accurate language, yes. It was possible to do. They did not do it. They failed. So what was necessary to be put in place following the failure of the old covenant, or the failure of the people to meet the old covenant? Well, yes and no. What we needed was a new covenant. Hebrews 8 through 10 focuses on, these are Hebrews 8, chapters 8 through 10, focuses on the work of Jesus as the mediator of a new covenant. The issue with the old covenant was simply that it was only a foreshadowing of the good things that would come. Its institutions were designed to prefigure, to illustrate the work that Jesus would do in the future. And one of my favorite subjects, the feast days, does exactly that. We can see through the feast days a timeline from Passover to Tabernacles. You can see the Passover is the death of Jesus. Tabernacles, they are dwelling in temporary shelters, sharing gifts, looking forward to that city whose builder is God. And so you can see there is, at least at the very least, the bookends of the feast days indicate the same sorts of timeline. It was a foreshadow of things that would come. Just like what we're talking about, the temple, the priesthood. All of these things foreshadowed what God was going to do. And God says, I will do nothing except that which I reveal through my prophets. All of these things were put in place specifically, intentionally. Thus, the priests prefigured Jesus, but they were mortal and sinners. They could not provide the perfection that Jesus did. They also couldn't provide the eternity that's necessary for a priest. And they ministered in a sanctuary that was a copy and shadow. Keep that in mind. That's a very, very critical piece of information relating to the heavenly sanctuary. Moses got a dictation of what was in heaven. And what he made wasn't the temple. it was a satellite temple. Jesus ministers in the true sanctuary and provides us access to God. The sacrifices of animals prefigured the death of Jesus as a sacrifice in our behalf, but their blood could not cleanse the conscience. Jesus' blood, however, purifies our conscience, and through him, having faith in him and accepting his mediatory work on our behalf, we can approach God with boldness. All right, so let's go ahead and do this last verse here. Hebrews 8, verses 8 through 12. And I'll read that just for brevity. Hebrews chapter 8, verses 8 through 12. For finding fault with them, he saith, Behold, the days come, saith the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers in the day when I took them by the hand to lead them out of the land of Egypt, because they continued not in my covenant, and I regarded them not, saith the Lord. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, saith the Lord. I will put my laws into their mind, and write them on their hearts. And I will be to them a God, and they shall be to me a people. And they shall not teach every man his neighbor, and every man his brother, saying, Know the Lord, for all shall know me, from the least to the greatest. For I will be merciful to the unrighteous. I will merciful to their unrighteousness, and their sins and their iniquities will I remember no more. What did God promise to us in the new covenant?
To write his law in our hearts and minds.
To make it internal. I don't think that it's an accident that the heart has two chambers, and that one chamber is slightly larger than the other. Because when you look at the law, you look at the Ten Commandments, 2 tablets, sure, but there's also 2 categories of those 10 Commandments. The first 4, a slightly shorter list, and the last 6, a slightly larger list. Neither of those are more important than the others. I would argue that the first 4 are the most important, but in the same way, Jesus, when asked which is the most important commandment, he said all of them. But I would say that our relationship with God is just as important as a relationship with other people, because when we deal with other people, we're dealing with God's creation. But first and foremost, we do not serve men, we serve God. Now,
Michael?
yes.
I like that in these verses, it says that he puts his laws in our hearts and minds, but he says all his people will know God. And I think that when he puts that law in our hearts and our minds, that is how we know God. That's how he established his kingdom.
It's in a way, it's a physical, actual interaction, because when we interact with someone, we know them. And when we interact with someone who is entirely controlled by the Spirit of God, in a way, we're actually interacting with that satellite temple of God. And I think that's one way that this statement is fulfilled. But beyond that, I think also we're headed to a point where through communications, and we'll get to this, literally everyone will be able to know who God is from the Scriptures, because everyone will have access. They'll all have the ability. And so it's also a part of the prophetic timeline, that everyone will know who God is. That second part here, for I will be merciful to their unrighteousness, and their sins and their iniquities will I remember no more, are the 2 portions before the end of time. For I will be merciful to their unrighteousness is still within the time frame where forgiveness can be given. And I will remember their iniquities no more. Once we have the close of probation, God says they've been logged, they've been recorded. I won't remember them anymore. We're done with those. Do we have anything? Okay. All right. I got a special thing I want to share with you in the last couple of minutes. When I was thinking about the further thought, and I was reading through this, The third paragraph jumped out at me. The desert generation was one, so we're in Friday now. The desert generation was the one that saw the amazing power of God unleashed in signs and wonders in their deliverance from Egypt. Now, very quickly, I want to read to you a small smidgen about telephones. The history of the telephone, this is from Tech Monitor. I don't know when this came out. I just have a screenshot right now. The history of the telephone dates back to 1667, when English polymath Robert Hooke created the first acoustic string telephone. Yet it would take 209 years until Alexander Graham Bell successfully carried out the first bidirectional transmission of clear speech on March 10th, 1876. Mr. Watson, come here. I want to see you, were the first words ever spoken over a telephone. John Colgan, CEO of Cloud Telephony Company, Solagari, said, from a faint crackle of audio in 1876, there are now 25 million landlines, telephones in the UK. That's just in the United Kingdom. We're not even talking about America, which is much bigger than the United Kingdom, as you probably know. More than 7 billion mobile devices worldwide, with billions of people from Edinburgh to Nova Scotia using internet-enabled audio, video, and instant message communications. Does that not sound miraculous to you when you think about it? But today, we pull out our cell phones and we go, oh, well, I don't know what the weather's like here. I'm thinking about driving to Mississippi. Let me check the weather in Mississippi. 209 years, what is it? No, it was, I think it's 140 years ago was when the patent was cleared for the telephone, about 1880. That's a long time ago. You wanted to find out what the weather was in a different place? You went there, and you found out. The Israelites lived in Egypt. They lived through the plagues. They saw blood and fire and miraculous signs. When they went into the desert, they saw further miraculous signs. But the miraculous signs had changed in a way. They had changed from powerful, strong deliverance, punishment, judgment, to ones of sustainment. Food from the sky, water from the rock, quail from the east. I believe the quail came in from the east or the west. The quail came in on the wind. But God was providing these miracles. We hear less about the Israelites and seeing the cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night, even though it was leading them. Through exposure, that miraculous event became mundane. It became everyday. And the Israelites began to lose faith. They started to fall asleep. We are living through that same cycle right now. And I talked to you about the telephone for that exact reason. Is it not miraculous that I can get on a phone right now and I can email or call someone in South Korea, someone of my old contacts, right this very minute? In real time, I can communicate with someone literally on the other side of the world. Right now, we're getting pictures from the Hubble telescope about things that we can't even hope to see with the naked eye. And they've just launched a new telescope that's supposed to be even better than the Hubble. We can go in and not saying anything politically, not saying anything about this particular issue, how you feel about it, or where you land on this line. But we are making vaccines for diseases, attacking viruses that we still can't determine if they're a living organism or a dead organism. We don't know if they're alive or dead. They're somewhere in between. We are attacking them at the microscopic level to prevent them from hurting us. Is that not miraculous? But we see it as so mundane. Oh, they came out with another vaccine. Oh, they came out with another booster. We see these things as mundane things. We had the Reformation, fire and blood and judgment. And now we're in the desert. The miracles are more sustaining for us. The miracles are, we're using these intercontinental messages to share the gospel. We are just trying to save people now. But we are on the verge of seeing these miracles again, where Christ returns for us. We are living through the parable of the 10 virgins. It's critical that we see Jesus for who he is, for all the roles that he fulfills, and how important he is to us individually on a daily, moment-by-moment basis. We must be connected to these things, or we will find ourselves asleep when Jesus returns. These roles, king, mediator, champion, high priest. Jesus is no ordinary man. And to claim that he is anything but legendary, anything but the Son of God, is to draw him down to us, not to elevate us up to him. There is so much more here. I pray that before you go into the next week, that you'll go back and you will look for deeper and more answers to these questions, that you'll really go through and dig deep, because God, from my experience, loves to hide the best gemstones just beneath the surface, just beneath where you have pushed really hard to get. He just wants you to push just a little bit further, and that's where the greatest blessings have been hidden. Just deep enough that you really, really have to dig for them. Do we have anything else that anyone would like to add before we close in prayer? All right, let's go ahead and finish with a prayer. Heavenly Father, there can be no greater gift. There can be no greater blessing than the ministry, the life, and the sacrifice of your Son. But Lord, it doesn't stop there. Your Son is a king. He is a high priest, and one that's going to return. I pray, Lord, that the people that hear this message will be able to share this message. The only thing, the only metric that you use to measure the economy of heaven is population. And I pray, Lord, that the people in this room and the people that are hearing this message will be able to have a direct impact on that metric. That they will find ways to minister to people that glorify you and draw them to you. Help us, Lord, to all act as priests serving our high priest, as servants serving our king, and as loyal soldiers serving our champion. Bless us, Lord, as we continue in your Sabbath, and we hear the words from you through your messengers in this church. We ask this in your Son's name, Jesus Christ. Amen. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you. Praise the Lord.